The laundry room in the basement of the Harlow Grand was not a place Conrad Ashby expected to find himself at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. He had come down looking for the maintenance log, his third night undercover, and he still hadn't found the source of the smell on the 14th floor. Something chemical, faint but persistent, the kind of thing that showed up in guest complaints but disappeared before the inspectors arrived. Someone in facilities had mentioned the laundry room kept records of the cleaning chemicals used by shift, so he followed the lead, clipboard in hand, wearing the same gray uniform the overnight housekeeping staff wore. He pushed open the door and stopped. The room was loud with the sound of industrial dryers, steam drifted near the ceiling, and in the far corner, between a folding table and a shelf of detergent bottles, a young woman sat on an overturned crate with her knees pulled to her chest, shoulders shaking. She hadn't heard him come in. Conrad stood still for a moment. He recognized her, not by name yet. He'd only been on the floor 3 days, but by the way she moved. She was the housekeeper on the east wing of the 12th floor. He'd seen her pushing her cart down the hall with the kind of efficiency that came from years of practice, not just training. She tucked hospital corners without thinking. She restocked every bathroom to the exact same standard, even in the rooms where checkout wasn't until morning and no one would notice. She was the kind of worker a hotel ran on without ever fully realizing it. Now she was crying in a basement laundry room at 11:30 at night, trying very hard not to make any sound. He cleared his throat softly. She startled, scrambling to stand, wiping her face with the sleeve of her uniform. "Sorry," she said immediately. "I'm sorry, I'll be back on the floor in a minute." "You don't have to explain yourself to me," Conrad said. She looked at him then. She was younger than he'd realized, late 20s maybe. Dark circles under her eyes that foundation hadn't quite covered. Her name tag said Wren. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. She was gripping the edge of the folding table like she needed it to hold her up. Conrad didn't leave. He set his clipboard down on the nearest surface and leaned back against the wall, not crowding her, just staying. "You don't have to be fine," he said. She looked at him like she wasn't sure what to do with that. The dryers kept turning. The steam kept rising. Neither of them said anything for a while, and somehow that was all right. Then she sat back down on the crate, and he understood she had decided to let him stay. Conrad Ashby was 41 years old, and had not set foot in a hotel laundry room since he was 23, when he used to load carts at the Harlow Grand's original location in Nashville. That was before he became the person who owned it, before 17 properties in 9 states, before a board of directors and a succession plan, and a Forbes profile he'd agreed to and then regretted for 3 years afterward. He had started the Harlow brand the way most people started things that mattered, out of something that hurt. His father, Gerald Ashby, had worked the front desk of a mid-range hotel chain for 26 years, not a glamorous job, not a terrible one either, except for the way the company treated the people who made it run. No sick pay past 3 days, no shift flexibility when Gerald's wife got sick, no acknowledgement ever that the man behind the desk was a human being with a life happening outside those automatic doors. Conrad had grown up watching his father come home with tired feet and a careful smile and the specific dignity of a man who refused to be made small by people who had never considered his full name. When Gerald died at 62, a heart attack, 18 months after retirement, as if his body only knew how to stop once it was finally allowed, Conrad was 30 and had just closed his second acquisition. He sat in the hospital and made a list on a legal pad. Everything he had promised himself he would do differently. That list became the Harlow Standard: paid family leave, mental health benefits, an anonymous employee reporting line that actually went somewhere, housekeeping staff who were never asked to share a single bathroom with 40 other people. For a while it worked. The Harlow Grand became known for low turnover, high guest satisfaction scores, and a culture that other hotel groups cited in industry panels. Conrad spoke at conferences. He believed what he was saying. Then the portfolio grew, and with it, the distance. The Nashville property was the original, the one he'd personally overseen. But by the time they'd expanded to 17 locations, Conrad was managing at the level of spreadsheets and quarterly reviews, and calls with investors who used the word efficiency the way other people use the word air constantly, without thinking, as though it were simply the condition of survival. He started getting signals, not all at once, small ones. A manager in Phoenix who'd quietly let the reporting line go to voicemail for 6 months. An exit interview from a Denver housekeeper whose comments were so specific and so bleak that Conrad had read them 3 times. A note finally slipped under the door of his actual office, not his assistant's office, his, in a plain white envelope. Handwritten, unsigned. You built something good. I don't think you know what's happened to it. Come see for yourself. He had read it in the elevator going down to the parking garage and stood there when the doors opened, not moving, until they closed again. That was 6 weeks ago. He chose the Nashville property because it was the first, because if things had gone wrong here, they'd gone wrong everywhere. He applied through the third-party staffing agency the hotel used for overflow seasonal hires, gave a fake last name, listed his previous experience honestly, cart loading, linen folding, and started a week later as temporary overnight housekeeping support. 3 nights in, he had found her crying in the basement. Her name, he learned over the following week, was Wren Calloway. She had worked at the Harlow Grand for 4 years, longer than most of the current staff. The shift supervisor, a man named Dale who Conrad had quickly identified as the specific kind of mediocre that gets promoted for never causing trouble, had her on the worst rotation in the building, back-to-back doubles on the checkout-heavy weekends, overnight solo shifts that were technically supposed to be covered by 2 people, and a schedule that changed week to week in ways that seemed designed to make it impossible to plan around. She never complained about any of it. She just adjusted and kept working. Conrad watched her the way he had learned to watch people in undercover visits, not with suspicion, but with the particular attention of someone trying to understand a system by watching one person move through it. He saw her cover a shift for a sick colleague without being asked. He saw her take her break 15 minutes late because a guest had asked for help finding the ice machine, and she couldn't bring herself to cut the conversation short when the woman mentioned it was her first trip away from home since her husband passed. He saw her stand in the hallway for 3 full minutes after a call on her cell phone, pressing the back of her hand to her mouth before collecting herself and going back to her cart. He did not ask her about the phone call. That was not his place. What he did was start talking to her during the overlap of their shifts, the 30-minute window when the carts were being restocked and the logs were being updated, and the fluorescent lights in the back hallway made everyone look equally exhausted. He learned she had a daughter. Her name was Maki. She was 6 years old and had a gap between her front teeth that Wren described once, briefly, with a softness in her voice that was different from every other way she talked about anything. He learned that Wren's mother watched Maki on the overnight shifts. That Wren drove a 2014 Civic with a heat issue she'd been nursing through 2 winters. That she was taking 1 online class per semester toward a degree she'd started at 22, and stopped at 23, and was trying to finish before 40. He did not learn any of this because she volunteered it. He learned it because he asked quietly, the way people ask when they're actually interested, and she answered in the careful way of someone who isn't used to being asked. The second time he found her crying, it was in the stairwell on the 3rd floor at 2 a.m., and he almost walked past. He would have, except that he heard her voice, not crying, exactly, but the tight controlled breathing that happens right before or right after. He stopped on the landing below. "You don't have to come up," she said. She'd heard his footsteps. He came up anyway and sat on the step below her, not looking directly at her, giving her the option of distance. "Dale cut my hours," she said after a while, not like she was asking for help, like she was simply stating a fact she had not yet found a place to put. Conrad kept his voice even. "Why?" He said my performance metrics were down, guest satisfaction on my floor. She exhaled slowly. "I had 1 3-star review in 6 weeks. 1, a guest who was upset about the water pressure, which has nothing to do with housekeeping." She stopped. "I can't lose the hours, I can't." Her voice didn't break on it. It just went quiet, which was somehow worse. "Maki's after-school program. It's $180 a month. I've already used the emergency fund for the car. If I lose even 4 hours a week..." She stopped herself. "I'm sorry," she said. "You don't need to hear this." "I do," Conrad said. She looked at him sideways. "I mean it," he said. There was a long pause. Then she said, Mashi thinks I work nights so I can be there when she gets home from school. I told her that's why. That I planned it that way, so I'd never miss the important parts. She looked at her hands. I didn't plan it that way. There was no choice in it. But I didn't want her to know that. I didn't want her to think her mom was just stuck somewhere. Her jaw tightened. She's 6. She thinks everything her mom does is on purpose. Conrad said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't shrink what she'd just offered. She drew me a picture last week, Ren said. Me, her, and a big yellow house. She said that's where we're going to live when she grows up and becomes famous. A small laugh escaped her, unexpected. She wants to be a marine biologist. She's 6 and she already knows the word bioluminescent. She sounds like someone worth protecting a schedule for, Conrad said. Ren looked at him for a moment. Yeah, she said quietly, she is. He went home that night to his actual apartment, not the studio rental he was using for the Undercover rotation, and sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and thought about what had been allowed to happen in a building he had opened with his own name. He had known, abstractly, that the culture had shifted. The anonymous note had told him that. The exit interviews had told him that. But there is a particular kind of knowing that only becomes real when you are sitting on a stairwell at 2 a.m. listening to a woman calculate whether she can afford 4 fewer hours and still keep her daughter in after-school care. That was a different kind of knowing. He opened his laptop and pulled up the staffing records for the Nashville property. It took him 40 minutes to find everything he needed. Ren Calloway, 4 years of service, consistently high peer evaluations, guest feedback that was, by any reasonable measure, excellent. One anomalous 3-star review connected to a documented maintenance issue. Hours cut by Dale Patterson, shift supervisor 11 days ago, with no HR consultation and no documented performance plan. Conrad sat with that for a while. Then he kept reading. He found 3 other employees with similar patterns. Hours quietly reduced. Schedules made inconvenient in ways that weren't technically policy violations, but functionally pushed people out. 2 of them had already left. The 3rd had filed a complaint through the anonymous reporting line 8 weeks ago. The complaint had been forwarded to Dale's direct manager, who had forwarded it to regional operations, where it appeared to have stopped entirely. Conrad closed the laptop. He sat in the quiet of his kitchen, the real kitchen, the one with good lighting and a coffee maker that cost more than Ren Calloway's car repairs, and felt something he did not have a clean word for. Not guilt, exactly. Not anger at Dale Patterson, who was only doing what the system had shaped him to do, something more foundational than that, a recognition of where he had looked away. His father had worked for 26 years in a building where no one knew his full name. Conrad had promised himself. He had promised himself out loud, in a hospital room at 30 years old, with his father's hand still warm. He had written it down. He picked up his phone and called his chief operations officer. It was nearly 4 a.m. She answered on the second ring because she always answered on the second ring, and he said, "I need you in Nashville by Thursday. Bring HR and legal. Don't tell anyone I'm here." There were 9 people in the conference room when Conrad walked in on Thursday evening. The meeting had been called under the pretense of a quarterly review. The staff had been told a corporate team was coming to discuss new benefit rollouts. Most of them looked mildly suspicious and moderately tired, the specific combination of a workforce that had learned not to expect good news from corporate visits. Conrad came in last. He was still wearing the gray uniform. Someone laughed nervously. Most of them just stared. He stood at the front of the room and looked at the faces. People he had worked beside for 3 weeks and people he had never met. The woman from the front desk who he'd watched handle a double booking crisis with the calm competence of someone who'd done it 100 times. The overnight maintenance man who had shown him, without being asked, how to properly log the chemical inventory in a way that the system actually recorded. Ren Calloway in the second row with her arms crossed and an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. "My name is Conrad Ashby," he said. "I'm the founder and CEO of Harlow Hospitality. For the past 3 weeks, I've been working the overnight housekeeping rotation here under a different name." The silence was absolute. "I want to start by saying something I should have found a way to say a long time ago." He paused. "This company was built on a specific promise, that the people who make it run would be treated like the full human beings they are, paid time to be sick, flexible schedules for people with families, a clear line to report problems without fear. He looked around the room. I have not been close enough to this building, or any of our buildings, to know that promise had been broken. I know that now. He watched Ren's expression shift almost imperceptibly. There will be changes, he said. Real ones, not policy documents that go into a drawer. Our shift scheduling will be managed through a centralized system with employee input. Hours cannot be reduced by more than 10% in a rolling month without HR documentation and a formal conversation. The anonymous reporting line is being restructured so that reports cannot be closed without a documented resolution. And, he paused, effective immediately, we're expanding the Emergency Family Support Fund to cover childcare gaps, medical copays, and transportation emergencies for all full-time employees regardless of location. He looked at the woman from the front desk. She had tears on her face and didn't seem to know it. I also want to address something specific. Conrad turned slightly. An employee on this property had her hours cut 11 days ago in violation of the process that is supposed to govern those decisions. That employee's hours are being restored, effective with this week's payroll, and the review that should have happened before any reduction will take place properly, with HR present and with her input. He did not look at Ren when he said it. He didn't want to single her out in a way that felt like spectacle. But he saw, in his peripheral vision, that she had unfolded her arms. I'm not telling you any of this to make you trust me immediately, he said. I know that trust is built in smaller units than this. What I'm asking for is the chance to start building it the right way. The applause, when it came, was ragged and real, the kind that doesn't know quite when to begin because it's not sure it's allowed. Conrad had done enough of these moments to know that the ones that mattered weren't the speeches. They were what came after. Afterward, he found Ren in the hallway outside the conference room. She was leaning against the wall, looking at the carpet. You knew, she said. Not when we first talked, he said. Not for a few days. By the time I understood what was happening with your hours, I was already... He stopped. He wanted to say it right. By the time I understood, I was already angry about it, on your behalf, not as a CEO, as someone who'd been working next to you. She looked at him. You listened to me talk about my car. I know. You sat on that stairwell at 2 a.m. I know. She was quiet for a moment. Why? Conrad thought about his father, about the legal pad in the hospital, about the note under his office door, about all the things he had gotten right, and then gradually, without noticing, started to get wrong. Because, he said, I made a promise a long time ago about what kind of company this would be, and I forgot to keep showing up to check if I was keeping it. He paused. You reminded me, not on purpose, just by being the kind of person who was doing everything right in a place that had stopped noticing. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, That's a lot of weight to put on a housekeeper. You're not just a housekeeper, he said. You know that. She looked at him steadily for a moment. Then something shifted in her expression, not a smile exactly, but the version of openness that happens just before one. Maki wants to be a marine biologist, she said. I remember. She has a science fair in March. She's doing bioluminescence. She made me look up 17 videos about deep-sea fish last weekend. A pause. She's going to want to tell you about every single one of them. Conrad hadn't expected that, the specific ordinary weight of it. I'd like that, he said. What happened over the next several weeks was not dramatic. That was the part Conrad had not anticipated, how small it would feel from the inside, and how large it would feel at the same time. He attended the science fair. He sat in a folding chair in a school gymnasium and listened to a 6-year-old with a gap between her front teeth explain the way anglerfish made their own light in water so deep that the sun had never touched it, and he thought about his father, and about all the kinds of darkness a person could learn to navigate when someone chose to stay nearby. He and Ren were not a story that moved quickly. That was not who either of them were. They were two people who had learned, separately and for different reasons, that trust was not something you claimed. It was something you demonstrated, slowly, in the specific ways that were hardest to fake. He brought coffee to the overnight shift twice a week. She texted him about the car when the heat finally gave out entirely, not asking for anything, just sharing the way people share bad news with someone who has made themselves available to receive it. He had it repaired without making it a gesture. She let him, without making it a debt. There was a Saturday in March, after the science fair, when all three of them ended up at the park near Wren's apartment because Maki had declared it mandatory. She ran ahead on the path toward the duck pond. Wren walked beside him with her hands in her jacket pockets. The light was the particular pale gold of early spring in Tennessee, the kind that made everything look like it was being remembered rather than witnessed. "She used to ask me," Wren said after a while, "why her dad wasn't around. She was 4 the last time she saw him. She barely remembers. She kept her eyes on Maki. For a while she thought maybe he just didn't know where we were. Like if we made ourselves easier to find, he'd show up." Conrad didn't fill the silence with anything. "She stopped asking about a year ago," Wren said. "I think she just rearranged things. She's good at that." A pause. "She told her teacher that her family was her and me and her grandma and her fish named Gerald." "Gerald's a good name for a fish," Conrad said. Wren looked at him. "He died in November. She held a full funeral. She asked me to say something." "What did you say?" "I said Gerald was a fish of great integrity and he would be missed by all who knew him." She looked away. "She made me say it twice." Conrad laughed. It surprised him how full it was. Maki appeared at the edge of the duck pond and waved with both arms, urgently, the way 6-year-olds wave when they have discovered something that cannot wait. Wren waved back. Conrad raised a hand, and Maki turned back to the ducks, satisfied, having located what she needed. There was a moment, sometime in April, that Conrad had not planned and did not have the right words for afterward. He had stopped by Wren's apartment with groceries, something he did occasionally now, without ceremony, and Maki had been at the kitchen table doing homework. She looked up at him when he came in, then looked back at her worksheet, then looked up again. "Are you going to keep coming over?" she asked. "If that's all right with you," he said. She considered this with the seriousness of someone reviewing a contract. "Gerald II needs feeding on Saturdays," she said. "I keep forgetting." "I can remember that," Conrad said. She nodded once decisively and went back to her homework. Wren was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had heard the whole thing. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him with an expression he was still learning to read, the one she wore when something had happened that she hadn't let herself expect. He stayed for dinner. He stayed until Maki fell asleep on the couch in the middle of a nature Maka documentary about the ocean, and he carried her to bed the way Wren showed him, with one hand behind her head, and he stood in the doorway of her small room while Wren tucked the blanket around her and thought about all the rooms his father had come home to. All the small ordinary acts of care that happened, in places that didn't make headlines and didn't get written up in industry profiles, but that were, in the end, the only architecture that lasted. He had come to this city looking for what had gone wrong with something he'd built. He had found that and fixed what he could fix. But he had also found something he hadn't known he was missing, not a redemption arc, not a lesson, something smaller and heavier and better than either of those things. He had found a woman who showed up every night to a job that undervalued her and did it with the kind of grace that came from knowing, in some deep and unargued part of herself, that how you do the small things is who you are, and a child who named her fish after the concept of integrity, without knowing that was what she was doing, and a Saturday afternoon in March with pale gold light and a duck pond and somebody waving with both arms because she'd found something worth showing. He stood in that doorway for a moment, in the dark and the quiet, and thought about his father, who had worked 26 years for a company that never learned his middle name. He thought, "I will not waste this." Wren came to stand beside him. They looked at Maki together. Then she leaned her head against his arm, just slightly, the way people lean when they have decided something without announcing it. Outside, the city was doing what cities do, indifferent and loud and continuous. Inside this apartment, something very small and very real was being built, the way all real things are built, slowly, out of ordinary materials, by people who chose to stay. I keep thinking about the moment Conrad found that anonymous note slipped under his office door. Not the speech he gave later, not the policy changes, or the restored hours, or any of the things that made for a tidy resolution. Just that moment, a man sitting in an elevator that had already opened and closed again, holding a piece of paper that told him something he hadn't wanted to know. That's usually how it works, in my experience. The truth doesn't arrive when we're ready for it. It arrives when we've been moving too fast to notice we left something important behind. Conrad built something real. He built it out of a genuine place, out of watching his father come home with tired feet and a careful smile, out of a promise made in a hospital room that I think he meant with everything he had at 30 years old. And then the company grew, and the meetings multiplied, and somewhere in all of that, the distance between what he intended and what was actually happening on the ground became a distance he could no longer see across from behind a mahogany desk. What strikes me about his story isn't the fall, it's the willingness to go back down to the floor, literally. In a gray uniform, under a different name, mopping hallways and logging chemical inventory, and sitting on a stairwell at 2 in the morning, listening to a woman calculate whether 4 fewer hours a week would cost her daughter an after-school program. That's not something you do if you only care about the optics of caring. That's something you do when your conscience finally gets loud enough that you can't negotiate with it anymore. And Wren, I think about her constantly when I think about this story. She is the person most of us will never fully see, the one who shows up every night, does the work right even when no one is grading it, covers the shift no one else wants, pulls the change from her own pocket for a guest who comes up short. She does all of this without any particular expectation that it will be noticed or rewarded. She does it because that's who she has decided to be, regardless of what the building around her reflects back. That kind of integrity, the kind that doesn't require an audience, is the rarest thing I know. It's also, I think, the thing that makes a person genuinely strong rather than just resilient. Resilience is surviving. What Wren had was something more like a moral spine. It held her upright even when the structure around her was working against her. And then there's Mackie, naming her fish Gerald and holding a proper funeral and asking her mother's colleague whether he plans to keep coming around, with all the directness of someone who has not yet learned to pretend she doesn't need what she needs. There is a kind of intelligence in that. Not book intelligence, but the intelligence of a child who understands instinctively that the people who stay are worth finding out about. What I take from all of this is something I've had to learn more than once. The promises that matter are not the ones you make publicly. They're the ones you make quietly, in rooms where no one is watching, to yourself and to the people who trusted you. And keeping them requires not just good intentions at the beginning, but the willingness, again and again, as things get complicated, to go back down to the floor and check. Conrad did that. It cost him something to do it. And because he did, Wren got her hours back, and Mackie got someone who remembered to feed Gerald the snack on Saturdays, and a little girl with a gap between her front teeth stood in a school gymnasium and explained bioluminescence to a man who had finally, after a long time of getting it wrong, gotten something very right. The cause was a promise made with a real heart. The effect was a life rebuilt with one.